Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite video game series, the Ace Combat series. In these games, taking place in the universe of Strange real creative name there, which is basically just Earth and our universe, but the land masses and names are different, you fly real-life aircraft in the various wars that these fictitious countries engage in. Now I'll spare you the details of the deeper lore of these fictitious countries, as I don't actually know that lore. I never really paid any attention to it, to be honest, because I just wanted to fly planes around and take down some enemy targets. And instead, I'll talk about the aircraft that are in the game. For the most part, the overwhelming majority of the planes in the game, both player-controlled and enemy, are just real-life aircraft. Like you can fly the F-4, or the A-10, or the F-16, or the Su-27. But occasionally, and oftentimes as a special encounter, or some kind of boss aircraft, a fictitious aircraft appears. It's usually some kind of advanced or super powerful piece of technology that inevitably you'll have to fight against. And in several of the Ace Combat games, one of the boss aircraft ends up being this incredibly massive aircraft, like the Ark Bird, and in the most recent game, the Arsenal Bird. The Arsenal Bird is this insanely massive, with a wingspan of 3,600 feet, unmanned flying aircraft carrier that held drones, missile launchers, laser turrets, an energy shield, and the special missiles called Helios missiles, which were massive airburst missiles. Powering this behemoth was actually a rather realistic outfit of contra-rotating propellers, with 2 sets forming the main thrust, and 6 other ones forming the supplementary thrust. These main propellers could also repair themselves after being damaged, somehow, and how exactly I don't really know. Powering the Arsenal Bird, interestingly, was microwaves, which sounds pretty bizarre, but the concept has apparently been tested and can actually work. Now, could it sufficiently power a 3,600-foot wide flying aircraft carrier? We'll suspend our disbelief, I guess. And also powered by these microwaves, at least indirectly through the Arsenal Bird itself, was a fleet of 80 unmanned drones that could be used for both offensive and defensive purposes. So how was this behemoth defeated in the game? Well, there were actually 2 of them. One of them was defeated with the power of an in-game railgun outfit called Stonehenge, and the other one was defeated by a kind of convoluted series of events that allowed the player character to destroy the plane's microwave power receiver, thus destroying the plane. Now, while all of that is pretty interesting and very fun to play, and now I might need to play Ace Combat 7 again, the design of the Arsenal Bird and the drones weren't just plucked from thin air. Both of them are actually based on real-life designs. The Arsenal Bird itself more loosely based on a design, and the drones effectively directly based on a real design. And interestingly, both of the influencing designs were from the same company. The drones were heavily inspired by the Northrop Grumman X-47B, some unmanned technology demonstrator drones from the 2010s, and the Arsenal Bird was clearly influenced by our subject for today, a prospective heavy bomber from the 1940s that attempted to create this sort of super bomber that could carry massive payloads great distances at high speeds. This is the Northrop XB or YB-35. Its story begins all the way back in the late 1920s with the interest and dedication of one Jack Northrop. From the earliest days of aviation, and as designers and engineers improve their understanding of aerodynamics, the concept of a flying wing grew increasingly fascinating, with these designs, in theory, having incredibly low parasitic drag and thus being far more efficient, fuel efficient in particular, and able to travel greater distances at greater speeds. But there are trade-offs, which is why the concept didn't exactly take over the world in compromised stability and control. But still, the theoretical benefits led to a multitude of attempts from several different countries and designers quite early on in the history of aviation to successfully bring this concept to life. One of those designers was Jack Northrop, joining the aircraft industry as a draftsman at just 21 years old. One of Northrop's early fascinations was the flying wing concept. After working for Douglas Aircraft and joining the newly founded Lockheed Aircraft Company in 1926, not too long after that, he began work on an early proto-flying wing called the X-216H. While the design technically wasn't a true flying wing, as it had a tail, it clearly served as a bridge between more conventional aircraft and the true flying wing that Northrop dreamed of. Featuring a more trapezoidal main body and wing with rounded wingtips, it also had a very thin twin-boom tail, and powering it was a single 90-horsepower engine that could either be in the tractor or pusher position. Interestingly as well, this proto-flying wing was also made entirely of duralumin instead of just wood, which is pretty odd considering that it was only ever going to be an experimental tester or a proof of concept, so it's not like they needed it to have improved defensive capabilities. Regardless, though, when it took to the air in 1929, it actually performed quite well, and apparently had basically no issues. Past this, Northrop's passion for the flying wing was placed on hold for nearly a decade, or at the very least his passion was put in the background in favor of more conventional designs and subcontract work for larger companies like Douglas. Towards the end of Northrop's time at Douglas, he rejoined them later on. He was working on a more pure flying wing design called the N1, and he would make it as far as a wind tunnel tester model before he left the company again and went out on his own as the Northrop Corporation. Shortly after his new company's formation, in mid-1939, Northrop began construction of a technically different but quite similar design in the N1M. In fact, it was basically a 1/3 scale tester model of the N1, as the N1's official name was the Model 1, and the N1M's name was the Model 1 mock-up. This mock-up was less a mock-up, really, and more of a proof of concept, a pure flying wing that, if successful, would be able to be scaled up considerably and hopefully make a functioning flying wing aircraft. Measuring in at 5.46 meters long, 11.8 meters wide, and 1.5 meters tall, the N1M was a true blue flying wing that also had some initial features that tried to make up for the lack of a tail and the lack of vertical control surfaces. Built purely as a proof of concept for the flying wing, the N1M would have a crew of just one in the pilot, no armor or armament of any kind, and two incredibly weak engines. Two Lycoming O-145 air-cooled engines with just 65 horsepower apiece. Each of these engines would be located towards the front of the plane, around the leading edge of the flying wing on either side of the cockpit, and the edge in front of them was wide open for air cooling. The drive shaft of each engine would extend to the trailing edge of the flying wing, and then connected to a pusher prop. On the trailing edge of each wing, the elevators and ailerons would be combined into two individual surfaces, one on each side, And of course, since there was no vertical surface, there was no conventional rudder. But effectively making a quasi-vertical surface would be the wingtips, which were angled slightly down at a 35-degree angle. While these obviously didn't fully serve as vertical surfaces, they did at least seek to improve the aircraft's stability and control. Also on these wingtips would be the plane's effective rudders, some split flaps that perform the same function. Lastly, the landing gear, some tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel and a wheel just behind each engine, would be fully retracting, and the entire plane was then painted bright yellow. Taking to the air on July 3, 1940, under the control of one Vance Breeze, the same guy that flew the prototype of the P-51 Mustang, the first flight of the N-1M was actually an accident, lifting off the ground during a high-speed taxiing test. Now, if the plane was so ready and willing to lift off the ground that it was doing it by accident, then surely that boded well for its actual flight performance. But once it took to the air intentionally, that performance was not great. While it managed to get off the ground, the plane failed to get more than a few feet off the ground. In essence, the first controlled flight was less flight and more hovering. The reason for this was twofold: low engine power and aerodynamic issues with the elevators and ailerons. Weighing around 4,000 pounds, the two 65-horsepower engines were woefully underpowered. After adjusting the elevons and replacing the initial Lycoming engines with two Franklin 0335 engines with nearly double the power at 120 horsepower apiece, the performance of the N-1M improved, and the top speed would max out at around 200 miles an hour, and control and stability was reported to be generally solid. So, with the concept appearing to be viable, Northrop went about promoting his design, and it would catch the eye of the U.S. Army Air Force for potential use as a bomber. Early in 1941, the Air Force requested from several companies that they submit designs for long-range heavy bombers that had a range of 10,000 miles, a cruising speed of 300 miles an hour, a bomb load of 10,000 pounds, and a service ceiling around 40,000 feet. The U.S. military at the time believed that it was possible, perhaps likely, that Britain would surrender to Germany, and so they wanted something that could fly across the Atlantic and attack mainland Europe. To this request, Northrop and Consolidated both received contracts for their XB-35 and XB-36 designs, respectively. The XB-35 would effectively be a massively scaled-up N-1M, measuring 16.18 meters long, 52.43 meters wide, and 6.19 meters tall. Powering it would be four engines that, at the time, were pretty new, but had substantial power in the Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major, with around 3,000 horsepower apiece, with the expectation and/or assumption that they would be able to output even more power shortly down the line. Much like the N-1M, the engines were placed more towards the leading edge of the flying wing, and the drive shafts would extend to the trailing edge. In the leading edge would be the air intakes for engine cooling, and on the trailing edge, connected to each engine, would be a set of contra-rotating propellers. With the combined power of these engines, the top speed of the XB-35 was estimated to sit around 390 miles an hour. For its armament, the massive bomber could carry a massive payload, and would have a rather substantial defensive armament peppered around its substantial frame. For distance purposes, it was estimated that it could carry a 10,000-pound payload around 5,000 miles. The standard payload was to be around 16,000 pounds, and at absolute maximum, the payload could be increased on a very short-range mission up to around 50,000 pounds. For defensive purposes, the XB-35 would carry a total of 20 guns, either 50 cal or 20 mil, in 7 total turrets. 2 of the turrets would be towards the center of the plane, 4 turrets would be in the outer wing sections, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom, and 1 turret would be in the tail. Altogether, with the plane's size and armament, the weight of the XB-35 would max out at 209,000 pounds. For Consolidated's part, they would propose their Model 36, which would later become the B-36 Peacemaker, and they would also propose a flying wing of their own, but theirs was even bigger and potentially more powerful, with a wingspan of 87.7 meters and a gross weight of 237,800 pounds. Consolidated's flying wing was kind of insane, and as a result, the project didn't get very far, and they instead focused their effort on the Model 36. Northrop would receive their production contract for their XB-35, ideally to be delivered in 1943, but also for official military research purposes. They were also asked to essentially remake the N1M, and so they would create the N9M as part of the same contract. Also designed to be a 1/3 scale model, the N9M was nearly twice the size as the N1M, measuring 5.48 meters long, 18.3 meters wide, and 2 meters tall. By and large, the design was effectively just a scaled-up N1M, but notably the wingtips weren't bent down at a 35-degree angle, but were rather straight now, and the engines were stronger Monasco Buccaneers with 275 horsepower apiece. With a gross weight of 6,326 pounds, the N9M would have a top speed of 258 miles an hour. First taking to the air on December 27, 1942, the initial flights of the N9M were plagued with mechanical issues, which were largely caused not by the flying wing design, but rather the engines. This made it rather difficult to gather data on the flying wing as a result, and this, combined with the fact that the first flight of the N9M was very behind schedule, this pushed the rather optimistic 1943 delivery date of the XB-35 much further into the future. Further N9Ms would be produced and flown, and despite further issues, which included, among other things, the cockpit canopy flying off mid-flight, sufficient data was gathered, and by mid-1944 the N9M was officially accepted by the Air Force. Meanwhile, for the XB-35 proper, production of the first model had begun all the way back in December 1942, but due to the aforementioned issues with the N9M and issues surrounding a lack of engineers and designers that could be spared for the project, and also a lack of facilities that could really build this thing, the first model wouldn't be completed until mid-1945, and even then, its first flight would be delayed considerably due to issues with the R-4360 engines and the gearboxes of their contra-rotating propellers. In the meantime as well, with the jet era on the horizon and the war appearing to be near its conclusion, the Air Force began to wonder if the XB-35 was even worth still pursuing. They did come to the agreement that it was, but also decided that some of the XB-35s, later redesignated to the YB-35, should be modified to fit Allison J-35 turbojet engines, and these would later receive the new designation of YB-49. But with the XB-35, due to its engine issues, the first flight was delayed by about a year, and on June 25, 1946, it finally took to the air for the first time. Flying for around 45 minutes, the first flight was apparently perfectly fine without any significant issue, but on subsequent flights, a familiar problem appeared in that the engines and contra-rotating propellers started malfunctioning and breaking down. These failures were frequent enough that on September 11, 1946, the first XB-35 prototype was grounded until these issues could be resolved, and shortly after the first flight of the second prototype on June 26, 1947, it too would be grounded for the exact same reason. Ultimately, the contra-rotating propeller system, while effective at delivering thrust, was suffering from severe mechanical issues, and as a result, Northrop elected to replace the contra-rotating props with single props, and with these new propellers, flight testing of the XB-35 would resume on February 12, 1948. While mechanically these single props were more reliable, they too had their fair share of problems, namely in that they provided less thrust and less power overall, and thus it degraded the performance, and they still suffered from significant vibrational issues that was never remedied. Additionally, due to the engines being buried in the body of the plane, they required both a rather complex exhaust system and some additional fans to aid in cooling, and both of these were rather difficult to maintain and keep in working order. Eventually, as 1948 came to a close, the Air Force determined that due to the design's issues, the increasing promise of jet power, and the comparative success of Consolidated, now Convair's, competitor design in the B-36, there was really no point in further pursuing the XB-35, and as a result, all of them would be scrapped by 1949. As for the jet-powered XB-35s in the YB-49, while these would see increased performance that boosted the top speed up to 493 miles an hour, the jet engines were a double-edged sword. They provided the increase in speed, but due to the rather excessive fuel consumption of early jet engines, the range of the YB-49 was significantly reduced. Combine that with frequent engine issues and failures, some control issues, and a bomb capacity that was considered to be too small for a now shorter range bomber, there really wasn't a reason to pursue the jet-powered versions of Northrop's flying wing either. The project would continue into 1953, though, with one prototype being tried as a potential reconnaissance aircraft. But for the bomber version, after the accidental destruction of the lone remaining bomber variant in March 1950 in a taxiing accident, the project was effectively dead. The failure of the YB-49 effectively signaled the end of military interest in the flying wing concept for nearly 40 years, as the military was largely focused on pushing the speed envelope with their new jet engines, and flying wings generally don't lend themselves well to supersonic flight. It wouldn't really be until radar and stealth technology improved later on in the 20th century that the flying wing would make a comeback for its potential application as stealth aircraft, which culminated in aircraft like Northrop Grumman's B-2 Spirit and B-21 Raider. So eventually, after decades of waiting, Jack Northrop's flying wing bomber became a reality, and apparently shortly before his death in 1981, Jack, in terrible health and not working anymore, did get to see the design details and a scale model of what ended up becoming the B-2, and allegedly, as he was in such poor health that he was unable to speak, he instead wrote down, "Now I know why God has kept me alive for 25 years. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Going back to Ace Combat for a minute, when you inevitably fight against the Arsenal Bird, it's a really cool mission, I think. But even setting aside the whole energy shield-wielding flying behemoth thing, probably the most absurd thing about the mission is that you kind of take it down by yourself. I mean, you do have allies, but you basically do everything on your own. One guy in one jet taking on 80 drones, multiple AA guns, missile launchers, and laser cannons. In reality, you'd be turned to dust in a few seconds flat. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.